During the flight home, the president came twice to the table where Smith and I were trying to record instant history. Smitty on a borrowed, unfamiliar electric typewriter. The first time, still subdued and speaking just above a whisper, he told us he wanted all of Kennedy's staff and cabinet officers to stay on, a hint of the let us continue theme that he was to sound before Congress 5 days later. The second time he came to inform us he would make a few remarks on his arrival, the brief "I ask for your help" and God statement that he read before TV cameras after landing at Andrews Air Force Base. For the rest of the trip, while the Kennedy party remained isolated in the rear compartment, LBJ tended to urgent business. He kept in touch with the White House Situation Room, manned by McGeorge Bundy for any sign the communist world might try to exploit the tragedy at Dallas. He called Rose Kennedy at Hyannisport to offer condolences on the loss of her son, and Nellie Connolly in Dallas to wish her husband a full and speedy recovery. He conferred for about 10 minutes with O'Brien on the congressional situation confronting him. The crippling Munt amendment to the Foreign Aid Bill was pending in the Senate the following week. As a generalization, it is fair to say that of those who stayed on the payroll for many months, MacBundy, a Boston Brahmin, and Larry O'Brien, a Massachusetts Pole, were the only Kennedy staffers who really functioned for Johnson during the takeover crisis. Both men were branded traitors and turncoats by the die-hard Kennedy partisans as a result. Bundy's answer to this was that the presidency, to which he was loyal, is bigger than any one man. O'Brien's was more succinct. You do what needs to be done. The others never seemed to forget that Johnson had been their enemy at the Los Angeles Democratic Convention in 1960. General McHugh, now out of the Air Force, never got over the fact that the plane didn't take off when he ordered it to. During the flight, still angry, he stopped at our press table, thumped his finger on my typewriter, and said, "I want you to write that members of President Kennedy's staff," he named O'Donnell, O'Brien, Powers, and himself, "sat in the rear of the plane with him and Mrs. Kennedy, not up here with them, the Johnsons." As another generalization, I think one could say that Manchester, in The Death of a President, overplays these events, dramatic as they were, for the purpose of heightened drama. For example, he has the Secret Service in hopeless disorder as a result of divided loyalties, with Agent Emory Roberts, number 2 man on the trip, defecting to the new president. The fact here is that at the hospital, Kellerman, number 1 man, ordered Roberts and his 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift to join the vice presidential detail in guarding Johnson. Another example, he gives the impression that Jackie Kennedy, eager to return to Washington, had to wait endlessly for a Texas judge to come and swear in Johnson. Then the full force struck her. An hour, she thought? My God, do I have to wait an hour? The fact is that Mrs. Kennedy had to wait just 20 minutes. She boarded the plane at 2:18. Judge Hughes boarded at 2:30, and the oath was administered at 2:38. Manchester also makes an ordeal of the picture-taking. Jackie was left with the impression they wanted her to look immaculate in the inaugural picture, and there was a maddening discussion about lens angles and close-ups. These impressions undoubtedly came from Mrs. Kennedy in her anguished 10-hour tape-recorded talk with Manchester. The truth is, however, that several people, including General McHugh, suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that she ought to get out of her blood-stained clothing and freshen up. She was adamant. "No, I want them to see what they've done," she told one Kennedy staff man as the Air Force One arrived at Andrews. As for Army Captain Cecil Stoughton's troubles with his camera, that lasted about 1 minute. In order to make a picture of the swearing-in, even with his wide-angle Hasselblad lens, Stoughton, a veteran Signal Corps photographer, had to climb up on a sofa bed and flatten himself against the rear bulkhead of the compartment. Even then, the principals were too close, so he asked them to move back. Perhaps, Manchester feels, the event should have gone unphotographed. My reaction was, and is, that the necessary delay was minuscule compared to the importance of recording indelibly the historic tableau. In enlarging upon the delay, Manchester baubles another fact. He states that after Mrs. Kennedy stood at the president's side, a voice from the semicircle of witnesses asked, "What about a Bible?" And then a search of the plane ensued. Actually, the missile was located before Mrs. Kennedy entered the room. I have a picture of Judge Hughes standing with the Johnsons, missile and presidential oath in hand, waiting for Mrs. Kennedy to take her place. Manchester also gives a distinct and inaccurate anti-Johnson spin to his account of the ceremony itself. After reporting Johnson's invitation to all aboard to witness the ceremony, he observes, "There was no stampede. 26,000 regular passengers hung back." He adds that Stoughton's negatives provide stark evidence that Kennedy's men did not want to be in the ceremonial picture. Those negatives, he says, did not record the presence of a single male Kennedy aide. Finally, he says patronizingly, President Johnson did not deserve this. Johnson not only didn't deserve it, it didn't occur. Neither was there any roundup of witnesses by Johnson, as Manchester reports. What happened was that when Johnson issued his invitation, the entire forward cabin of the plane emptied into the conference room, pushing the Johnsons and Judge Hughes almost to the rear wall. That's why Stoughton had to move the principals back before he could take a picture. Smith and I counted 27 perspiring bodies in the 12 by 15 room, in addition to the president's desk and chair, a sofa bed, and several bulky lounge seats. When the Kennedy party, those looking after Jackie, entered from the rear, there was simply no place for anyone but Jackie to stand without getting between Stoughton and the Johnsons. For this reason, they stood aside and did not appear in the single official Stoughton photograph released by the White House. But Stoughton's unpublished pictures show that 6 male Kennedy staffers, O'Donnell, O'Brien, Powers, Kilduff, Admiral Berkeley, and Major General Clifton, were in the compartment. Kenny O'Donnell, pictured by Manchester as pacing the corridor outside the bedroom like a caged tiger, his hands clapped over his ears as though to block the oath, stood to Jackie's left with his hands at his side. Larry O'Brien stood immediately behind Judge Hughes, but neither was in the picture so fraught with significance to Manchester. The only conclusion to be drawn from this is that Manchester, who refers knowingly to Stoughton's negatives, never really saw them. Finally, throughout his narrative of events aboard Air Force One, Manchester suggests time and again that Johnson was unseemly in his haste to assume the presidency, and that without justification he invoked Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as his authority for being sworn in at Dallas rather than waiting until he got back to Washington. What advice Bobby gave Johnson when they talked that afternoon is moot. Johnson told the Warren Commission the Attorney General advised him to take the oath in Dallas. Bobby told Manchester, obviously, that he gave no such advice. As Attorney General, he couldn't understand the need for a rush, and on a personal level, he preferred that any investiture be deferred until his brother's body had been brought home, says Manchester in his book. It could be argued that Bobby's silence at one point in his emotion-choked conversation with Johnson gave consent. It is reasonable to assume that Johnson thought a return phone call from Katzenbach in the Attorney General's office, during which Katzenbach read the oath, was tantamount to a go-ahead. But such hair-splitting, to which Manchester devotes pages, is beside the point. The important point about Johnson's takeover is that it was eminently wise, no matter what advice he got, for him to take the oath of office in Dallas as soon as possible. He was president. He did not have to get consent from anyone. Whether Bobby, in a state of shock at Hickory Hill, thought at that moment in terms of orderly transition is not important, though if he didn't, he can certainly be forgiven. A long tradition of quick succession in such circumstances and the uncertain state of the world at the time dictated that Johnson, already president under the Constitution, should take his oath to defend the Constitution at the first opportunity. Not to have done so would have tended to perpetuate the vacuum of power that seemed to exist in the first 2 hours after the fatal shot. Similarly, the argument that Johnson should have limped home aboard a backup plane, leaving Jackie and the dead president behind, is a conspicuous example of frivolous, biased nitpicking. Whether or not Manchester or O'Donnell approves, the propriety of Johnson accompanying the body of his martyred predecessor home is unassailable. I shudder to think of the charge of haste and callousness that would have been leveled at Johnson if he had dispatched Mrs. Kennedy on that lonely journey bearing only the casket, herself, and a corporal's guard of aides. Kennedy, at that point, belonged to the ages, not to his aides. President Johnson is capable of crudities. Like his predecessors, he can be ruthless, callous, self-centered, and profane. But it just happens that on that wretched afternoon, Manchester notwithstanding, he rose to the occasion as few men could have after having such an awesome burden suddenly and unceremoniously thrust upon them. To put it more precisely, the hours from 1 p.m. Central Standard Time when Kennedy died to 4:59 p.m. Central Standard Time when Air Force One touched down at Andrews were 4 of Johnson's finest. To most of the passengers on that eerie flight back, and I have talked to most of them, it is incomprehensible that Johnson is now being faulted for his performance. Most would agree, I think, with Manchester's own editor at Harper & Row, Evan Thomas, who wrote in a letter, even before the legal hassle over the book's publication, that it was, in part, gratuitously and tastelessly insulting to Johnson, and for that matter, the memory of the late President Kennedy, while at the same time being a really considerable piece of work, one might almost say a great book. Thomas concluded, and I must agree, that it's about as though Manchester had become so involved in this tragic narrative that he could not resist turning it into a magic fairy tale.